doesn't say that everybody should do the same thing at the same time, which means that various places do liturgy in various ways. For instance, I noticed this morning that after communion, Pastor Cunningham gave a beautiful prayer, but then I said to myself, she didn't use, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying this is the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, comfort and preserve you through life everlasting, which is the phrase that Lutherans treasure because it is the pro nobis, it's the for us. But, you know, it's okay not to have it. You don't have to have the Kyrie either. In fact, you don't have to have a lot of things. You can move the parts of the service around. Some people have the confession at the beginning. Some people have it closer to the communion. So in fact, the confession is not really a part of the liturgy at all. In LBW, all the writing about this, even in the book itself, it says the confession may be used. It's an option. And of course, at certain times you want to use it, as Lent maybe or Advent, but other times, like on Easter and other holidays, you might not wish to use it. So it becomes optional. Now that creates, in my mind, one of the significant problems in liturgy for all of us, is that I grew up thinking, I don't even have to look at this book anymore. I knew the songs, I knew the words, I knew the order in which things were going to be done. So I could just, you were right, I could put the book down and sing the hymns and the liturgy. But then other people said, that is, in the words of my son, boring. Why do we have to do the same thing the same way Sunday after Sunday? My wife Lucy characterized the statement when I served the parish in Philadelphia, and it was a great parish to be in. But the 9 o'clock service was the same Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And she said, you know, I get the feeling. May I say this? I get the feeling, Robert, that if I left this congregation at 9 o'clock today and came back next Sunday at 9:06, I wouldn't have missed anything. It would have all been the same. So there's a value in that, however. I mean, the value is that things are predictable, things are comforting. You don't have to worry about things when you go, how many pages you have to look at of information that's handed. Is that me making this sound? No. What am I doing wrong? Don't move it. Just like liturgy. Pretty much, yeah. So I trust that in the conversations you're having in these kind of forums, and maybe in worship, you keep these ideas in mind. How much can you keep that's steady, predictable, and cherished from the past, and yet keep going into the future by changing creatively? I will now remain inflexible. So element 1 was the biblical witness. Element 2, which I've spent a lot of time talking about, is the tradition of the church itself, in terms of its theological tradition, in terms of its hymnic tradition. Oh, I wish I could talk to you about hymns because it's my favorite subject. But there's a third element too, that has had a very important part in our liturgy, and that is the life and experience of the people of God from the past, the present, and the future. As a pastor for over 40 years in the church, I've come to value and understand and treasure and sometimes be very much in awe of what the people bring to liturgy. They bring the fact that they are sinners, and therefore we have confession. We are saints and sinners. We're simultaneously justified and sinners at the same time. In fact, one of our old friends from the seminary, Jim Nestigan, I used to like to have worship with him because you have to understand this, at Luther Seminary there was this room in the back where we'd change robes and we'd stand and have a word of prayer. And every time Jim Nestigan would come in to do chapel 2 or 3 times a year, he'd say, well, Brusic, I really like doing chapel with you. He said, because you're one of the really good sinners in this place. Which emphasized this aspect that we are sinners in need of God's grace, which we don't merit, but which comes to us and is given kind of freely. We come from families, or we're alone. We are lonely people in need of reconciliation with one another, with God, with creation, with ourselves, because we create lives that are full of misery sometimes with habits. We're sometimes scared. I am always scared when I look at the front page of the newspaper day after day and see what's going on in the world. And I want to take that all and put that before God. And that shows up in the preaching, that shows up in the prayers, that shows up in the basic underpinning of the liturgy that we celebrate Sunday after Sunday. A body of believers, a community of saints and sinners. We believe in the community of saints, as we say in the Creed. And so our worship through the liturgy organizes and reflects the bundles of anxieties and joys that we as people possess. So those are the elements that are brought together to create the rich liturgies that we enjoy. Okay, now I mentioned a number of things about liturgy that are both problematic and opportunistic. I list a whole series of questions there that are really worthy of discussion. Maybe not this morning, but if you have time in the future, if you have opportunity to talk about these things. I like to believe, for instance, that liturgy is sturdy but flexible, as we've talked about the changes. But can liturgy be bent and maybe even broken? I've been in places where the liturgical forms are just kind of thrown out the window, and all that's left is really what I feel and the good times that we can have together. And I sometimes wonder if that's enough. The liturgy has a recognizable shape and form, but you don't want to go back to the days of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago, where everybody in every place did their own thing without any connection at all to the history or to the Bible or to the human development that we talked about. There's a whole business of thinking things afresh. And LBW put us on the track, and it shows up again in the ELW, that something that had been lost in our thinking was the nature of baptism. Now, we like to think of baptism as something that happens once and for all, and that is true, liturgically as well as theologically. But, you know, when I was growing up, baptism used to take place like on a Saturday afternoon. Does that happen here, or do you have baptisms in, I hope I get it right, in the service? Yeah. Ah, good. You're doing it right. Because it was felt that baptism really is a community celebration. It's a welcoming of the person into the community, as well as a recognition that this sinner is now saved through grace and water and through the promise. But that's not all the places where we think of baptism. Stop and think about the occasions where we might use an affirmation of baptism service. There's one in the ELW. It's very lovely. It calls us to remember on different occasions that we are children of God and we receive gifts of the Spirit. Baptism also is reflected in other services. If you've ever been to a funeral service, and I trust many of you have, you will notice that it says when we were baptized into Christ, we were baptized into His life. So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And that's a reminder of our baptism, even at death, as it was when we were brought, maybe being carried by our parents' arms, or as adults, and often there's adult baptism as well, that we affirm our baptism Sunday after Sunday. And if indeed an evangelical ever corners you and says, "Are you saved, brother?" And you say, "Yes." And he says, "Wow, when were you saved?" The answer is in my baptism. And Sunday after Sunday, and day after day, by God's grace, which reaches down liturgically and formally. So think about this whole business of liturgy as celebrating our life in Christ and God's gifts. But you know, liturgies differ in different times and in different places. My brother-in-law is Unitarian, and he invites us to go to the Unitarian service every now and again. And we don't argue about it, but we do talk about it. And they have a liturgy in the Unitarian Church. And it's for that congregation, and it's a congregation that's bursting at the seams, they celebrate in their own way liturgical forms. We attended a Methodist church not that long ago, and there's a liturgy that's there. It's tailor-shaped, but it has all the elements that we're talking about. Occasionally we go to the cathedral, the Episcopalians, where they really kind of do it up around. You know, someone was asking me about incense earlier. They do incense, and they do songs and psalms and the choir, which is really pretty good. But they have liturgy too. So you get this liturgy that stretches across the spectrum. If you ever been to an Orthodox church? You have. Is it a 10-minute affair?
Well, it go for hours.
Goes on for hours, right? Particularly their vigil service on the night before Easter. It can go on for 4 or 5 hours. Lucy and I went a couple of years ago at the invitation of some friends to, remember, to St. Mary's Cathedral in Minneapolis. And beautiful. You talk about incense there too. You know, just the place was full of smoke, and then as the smoke billowed up, you looked at the walls, the ceilings, and everything was full of color and icons. And then the liturgy started to go, it goes on for hours and hours. Very formal liturgy, but beautiful. Quite a stark difference between the totality for hours. And let's say a service, a Quaker service. I went to a Quaker service some years ago and discovered myself sitting quietly the way you are now until I was compelled to speak. I was never compelled. But other people were, and that had a liturgy by not having a lot of clergy. So liturgy is all over. And so basically what I've been talking about is the development of liturgy within the Lutheran tradition. And I grew up, and I know this was stated in the sermon today too, I grew up where we only had communion a couple of times a year, 4 times a year. St. John's Lutheran Church in Passaic, New Jersey. And my grandmother didn't like to go to communion because she said, you can't eat anything before you go to communion because you're supposed to present yourself pure and holy. She says, I can't make it to 11 o'clock in the morning. So she never went to communion. Well, the service, by and large, the other 40-some odd times a year, was the service of the Word. And that, by the way, is the common service book. It presumes that the service ends at one point, but now we've understood that the service is called the service of Holy Communion, and many congregations, including this one, I guess, have communion on much more. How often do you serve communion?
Every other week.
Every other week. That's the way it was in the parish that I left in. I'm told now that my successor has communion every week. So that's a kind of goal that some people, some congregations